Okay, so let's get our Bibles out, and we're going to do a little bit of a Bible drill here as we look at chapter 12. I want you to begin your study of chapter 12 by going back to Genesis chapter 37. Don't you think that's appropriate, that you should always begin your study of Revelation chapter 12 and Genesis? I think so. It only makes sense. Okay, now actually chapter 37 is a very famous passage of Scripture. You know it. It's part of the story of Joseph. It involves his dreams. But let's drop down to verse 9. So this is Joseph, and he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" Now, just stop right there. Now, you know that passage, but I want you to think about the possibility that that is rolling forward to chapter 12 of Revelation. So let's do a little comparison and contrast here. The first thing I want you to see, and you know this, and I believe we talked about it, at least in part, in the biblical archaeology class, where we think we really approached Joseph as a type of Christ. So, you think about his ethics, how he refused to sleep with Potiphar's wife. He was a visionary. He was a very, very righteous person. He becomes a prime minister in Egypt, essentially the king. Only one person more powerful than he, of course, being Pharaoh. And so, he is a very interesting person to compare to in this story, I would say. Now, similarities include sun, moon, and stars in both. Both have royal connotations. Who bows down? And we know that Joseph ends up as a prime minister, essentially second in line to Pharaoh. And what happens in chapter 12 of Revelation is that we have this great sign that appears in heaven. The woman's clothed with the sun, the moon's under her feet, and on her head is what? A crown of 12 stars. A crown of 12 stars. So they both are royal in their connotation. There's essentially here a royal theme. That's what I want you to pick up here, a royal theme. Now, chronologically, when we think about this woman, you know that in verse 2, she's pregnant, she's crying out in birth pains, she gives birth. That's the great sign, because that's how this begins, and a great sign appeared in heaven. But verse 3 has another sign. Now, it doesn't say necessarily, and that one might say, oh, it's another sign of the same kind. I think it would be a lesser sign. It's another sign, and in heaven what? It's the great red dragon, which we know is Satan. So this is going to create, in the literature, in this story, a beautiful tension, where you have this royal woman, and now you have this dragon, who is a great dragon in red, very fearsome and scary. And what's going on here? It is getting ready to kill the male child. But before that, look at how it describes this dragon. He has 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. This is very, very, speaks of great power. Horns represent power. 7 heads, 10 horns. And it has diadems or crowns on the heads. So it's when you think about the symbolism here, the comparison and contrast, what you have are really what we know is going to be the Christ child who comes as a baby. speaking of his humility. And here we have the dragon who's coming in pomp and circumstance. Oh, how like Satan, right? He's all about the show. He's all about himself. Jesus comes humbly because he is not preoccupied with his own greatness, though he is, King of kings and Lord of lords. So note that. Very interesting, the comparison and the signs, and yet the first sign is the great sign. The first sign is a great sign. So now, also, you get this interesting stuff. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven. Interesting. Presumably, and scholars say that describes angels that he's pulling down. Stars often refer to angels in this type of situation. And then it says, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who, now this is important, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, this is all, it's a shorthand way of describing great history. Now, I would argue that the woman is, I would describe her as the people of God. Historically, starting out as Israel. Now, some people say that the woman is Mary. Obviously, Jesus was born of the Virgin, so there could certainly be a sense that it's Mary. But in this case, it's so much more than a single person. And really, the humility of Mary would forbear her being singled out in this sense, I think. And just thinking of the Magnificat and whatnot. So I want you to see that the woman continues. She's in labor pains, she has birth, and then she continues and she flees to the place that's prepared by God for her to nourish her for 1,260 days. And later on, we see that, say at the end of the chapter in verse 17, that the dragon's furious with the woman. He makes war on the rest of her offspring. And that clearly speaks to the church. So I think it's fair to say that the woman represents the people of God, Mother Church. Don't spend too terribly much time. I don't think it's strictly Israel. I don't think it's strictly Mary, the mother of Jesus. So let's look at it in a bigger picture. And now, what I want us to think about is that in this passage here, we're going to see that she is taken to a place. I don't want you to think of that as necessarily a specific place. Like, oh, it's a few people and they're being, taken off to a safe place in the mountains or something. It's really more, I think, of a way of speaking of God's preservation for his people during the time of crisis. So, just kind of roll with that from a literary standpoint. So, something interesting happens here. I've said before in times past that you have to think of this book as a dreamscape, that it's not designed to be understood as flowing in a chronological fashion. Now let me give you an example of that. So what happens here? We have verses 1 through 6 seem to tell somewhat of a chronological story. Seems that way. It's a nice story. It comes to the point where the child has gone up to heaven and the church, if you will, is carried off into the wilderness to be protected. And then, verse 7, now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And verse 9, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who's called Devil and Satan. And then you hear a loud voice in verse 10 saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night. verse 11, they've conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of the testimony. And that blood of the Lamb also links back to Christ's passion and why the cross, not only was it a crowning, but it was also a victory over Satan. The blood of the Lamb defeats him. And they love not their lives even unto death. And verse 12, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Now, I argue that that is an interlude within an interlude. There's a break in the story. Think about it. What happens? The woman in verse 6 is being ushered off. She's fleeing into the wilderness for 1,260 days. And then you go and you get some more backstory. Let's talk about what's really happened to Satan. I would argue that there is not really a sense of chronological time here. It's not like, here's the dragon, and this is going on with Jesus, right? And then all of a sudden, war arises in heaven. Because then what happens? In verse 13, it resumes the original story. So 7 through 12 is more of an aside, an interlude within an interlude. In verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman and gave birth to, who'd given birth. And so what it's really doing, it's really giving you backstory that tells you what really happened with Satan. That at some point in time, though it wasn't like, he was up in heaven when Jesus dies and now he's down, and that, don't think of it as a chronological, okay? This could have happened a long time ago, all right, in time, if we measured it in time. But what it also does for us is it really starts to set the stage for really the wrath of Satan. It kind of fills you in as to why Satan is going to oppress the church in such a strong way, for is his time is short. Now, one thing that I find interesting is all of this is being referred to in the signs, for example, or occurring in heaven. And heaven, it's kind of this heaven place, is that where God dwells, or is it out? Is it just in the air, or is it out in space? It's a little unclear, because really in this case the Greeks using the same word that you would use in chapter 4 where God's throne is. But one thing I can tell you is that in chapter 19, which I believe we talked about some weeks ago, where we have the calling for the birds who fly in the air to come and feast on the flesh of kings and captains, etc. That word in Greek it would be like mid-heaven. And so the air above us where the birds fly would be mid-heaven, for example. But that's not where the sign is described. And so one of the things I really want you to think about is that, and I've said this before, and I probably will say it again, but there is a sense in that chapter 11 with the two witnesses is task-oriented, what's going on from a human perspective. Whereas now chapter 12 is more of a spiritual warfare perspective. So what's interesting, in this dreamscape, you have to bear in mind as you're reading through this, it's given you different perspectives on the same events. Hence, last time we talked about our triangle, which showed that there were all the same periods, but they were using different numbers for symbolic purposes to describe the perspective that's going on, that's associated with that particular norm, like 1,200 or number, 1,260 days, something's going on. 42 months, something else is going on. And so next time, in our next section, we're going to move into chapter 13. And we're going to start to see how that 42 months starts to play into things again. So let's close chapter 12 with this.